Hi, and once again, my fellow COVID-19ers. This is Mark Griffin, Director of Customer Solutions here at Construx. We're a team of software engineering experts led by legendary author Steve McConnell. Here we believe every software team can be more successful at delivering higher levels of business value. Every episode, we talk with one of our consultants, exploring different types of engagements. We describe the issues those engagements are designed to address and how we solve them, and we have a bunch of fun along the way. So let's get to it. Today, we welcome back to the podcast Erik Simmons, who comes to us once again from the beautiful downtown Beaverton, Oregon area. A quick reminder, Erik is a senior fellow with Construx. He has more than 30 years experience as a system and software engineer, a consultant, a change agent in both public and private sectors. He is internationally recognized for his expertise in agile transformation, software and systems life cycles, solutions thinking, complex adaptive systems engineering, and requirements engineering. So welcome back, my friend, to the show that never ends. That ELP line has a lot more meaning these days, eh?
Yeah, well, you take me back to high school there, but yeah,
High
I
school,
date
yeah.
myself.
Early 70s, something like
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
that works.
they were good stuff. So today we're going to explore a hot button topic, one that has been a hot button topic for what seems like decades. And that's this idea of metrics with regards to software engineering performance. And for today, let's call it measuring software engineering performance for the purposes of labeling. And to set context for this conversation, since this topic could rat hole into so many different niches, as you know, let's focus on some specific areas today. And those look like this: cultural issues around measurement, the distinction between metrics and indicators, and lastly, controlling the effort in programs like these, both in cost and time. And I think we'll have some opportunity towards the end of today's podcast to give some examples of recent work we've performed as sort of illustrations, and recognize there are many other topics we could explore on this particular big topic. So maybe we return at a future date to continue to work through different ideas. Make sense?
Sure.
So let's lead off into the first topic by stepping back for a second and defining terms. So, Erik, you like to use operational versus aspirational notion. Explain, Lucy.
Yeah, this is a nice way to separate some of the overarching concern around metrics and measurement in general. We can look at measurement related to operations in the how are we doing space. And maybe you could use a dashboard metaphor for that kind of measurement.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And then there is more aspirational measurement and what's our progress toward our goals, not simply how we're doing. And here, the metaphor is more of a map than a dashboard.
Okay. Big picture kind of thing, leading towards like, oh, let's see where we're going to go and focus our attention.
Right. There are some similarities across that for measurement, certainly the measurement theory that applies to both those areas. But there are also some pretty interesting differences in the way operational versus aspirational measurement can be done in terms of setting objectives, in terms of defining scales, all those things. So, it's best to pick a focus.
Okay, so let's focus on the dashboard idea for today. Like you said, many of these concepts are report directly to both, but I think the dashboard probably would resonate for a fair number of folks, and so let's address that topic and frame it. So, in the context of measurement, one of the things that's most interesting to me in talking to lots of clients is that there's a surprising number of organizations that simply don't measure anything, and we have done in the last 6 to 9 months, we've been doing some business development conversations with clients and partners and different folks in the context of market research calls to try and look at what are people interested in doing down the road and what kind of services that they're looking for. And some of those calls have really outed the fact that there's a surprising number of people that just don't do anything. So are there cultural issues that maybe explain why they don't measure anything, Erik?
Well, there are, but I would also say that I'm old enough that the word surprising no longer applies to me, at least, because I would have said a depressing number of organizations
Yeah,
don't
that's a
measure
better word,
anything.
perhaps. Yeah, okay.
But it's consistent. It hasn't just happened to us. It's not a new problem. People have failed to pay good attention to measurement for some time, and it is depressing. Sure, some of these issues are cultural in origin. One of the things I find a lot in organizational assessments, which we talked about in the last podcast, is a lack of trust between teams, between business units, up and down the management chain. And in these assessments, I often invoke what is probably the most popular and useful model of trust. That says that trust is created from three principal factors. The first is ability, second is benevolence, and the third is integrity. So if you've got the ability and the benevolence and the integrity, then you can create trust. If you don't, it doesn't matter what you incent or foment about, you're not going to get people to trust each other. So in the measurement space, we have to understand how to calculate and interpret the data that is in the measurement program. And we need to use the data for good, as in benevolent purposes. We need to honor our commitments to confidentiality, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is a big cultural problem in measurement around lack of trust.
Hmm. That's really interesting. I mean, and I mean, I think I've always heard the pejorative way that people describe measurement and metrics is gaming the system, right? I mean,
Yeah, and why would we game because we don't trust again? Because I can't expose my true performance to you because something's going to happen that's a threat to me or something like that.
right. There was an old Dilbert about that, wasn't there? About the little engineer, little bald-headed engineer that kept talking about
Wally's
go,
going to code him a minivan.
coding a minivan. Exactly.
Yeah,
That's a classic example
yeah,
that everybody remembers that, right? And it's
yeah,
just it is kind of like if you have a particular system that people have in mind, they will align to that, perhaps, right?
yeah. But it's interesting that this is a long-lived problem as well, and I think that we do well to remember that in this age when Agile and Lean and things are so popular and front of mind. These it doesn't magically eliminate these problems. They're still there in the culture and in the measurement.
Yeah, and maybe that's why you used the word depressing when we kicked this off. That
Yeah.
we continue to run into these issues, and have been around for a long, long time.
Sisyphus is my patron saint.
So, how about another cultural thing, like something about performance measures beyond perceived effort or resource utilization, things like that? I mean,
Yeah, that's a good one because those that do measure often measure only what you would coin as the perception of effort. Uh, I've worked for companies before that were famous for the parking lot test, where the CEO would drive by the parking lot at 6:30 and see how full it was. And this was his metric for how hard people were working. You know, they'd take a look on Saturday or at 7 o'clock on a Friday night and see who was still working. And this was good performance if you had a lot of people in the parking lot in the off hours. They were spending 60 hours a week at the job.
Sure.
And we've all seen, I think, the ills of focusing too much on resource utilization and trying to keep the system running at 100% utilized rather than, as Don Reinertson and many others have eloquently said, focusing on throughput. Because anybody who's been in a traffic jam before COVID-19, when there was traffic, uh,
Right.
knows that when you run a system at 85, 95% utilization, bad stuff happens with even a small perturbation. So a lot of cultures simply measure perceived effort or resource allocation and call it a day. And none of the benefits of really good metrics and indicator programs can come from that.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, and I think uh, when this particular podcast airs, I think we're still going to find ourselves in some level of restriction. There's still going to be an awful lot of people, maybe a majority of people, working from home, continuing to work from home. And so, you talk about this idea of trust. You talk about the idea of the CEO driving around the parking lot at 6:30 in the morning. You now have the emergence of these, I don't know what the right word is for it, but they're sort of internet sniffers or things that people are monitoring activity online. And
Yeah,
I think I've heard some, there's a range out there, right? But there's some draconian kind of environments where people are really being measured by, do they have Facebook up on their machine? Are they running something else during the day? How often are they online?
right. Now,
You
there
know,
again, this has been a problem forever. uh, the various schools of management, the various philosophies of business, where you're looking at people as needing to be controlled and not doing the right thing if not controlled, or you trust people. So all of that is just so ancient.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
hasn't gone away, and we're going to see some companies adapt a lot better to the new reality than others in
Right.
that space.
I mean, and I mean, you alluded to this, the notion of past behaviors, right? A CEO that was burned once wants to kind of punish those pit folks or punish a bad behavior in the past, or maybe even use some, they'll measure bugs and whatnot, and sort of tie that to an individual performance and beat on people
Right.
that way, right? I get
Now,
it, but
organizational history is a big influence here. And I've encountered a lot of organizations in the assessments and in just general consulting where some event or series of events has really shaped the way they look at failure, not as a learning opportunity or something to be even celebrated if you're in that school, but as something to be avoided, buried, penalized, etc. And it becomes this negative thing. So the culture evolves coping mechanisms when the sort of Damocles hangs over its head like that. Um, and you're right that misusing data, that's the single best way to kill a metrics program in an instant. I've
from
seen
both
that happen.
sides, right? From the data aggregation perspective, because people stop participating because they feel
They're
that
threatened.
the data is not being used correctly. Or
Exactly. And this happened, I saw this firsthand when a multinational was that I was working at was adopting the capability maturity model. This was last century for those of you who weren't alive then. And uh,
ouch, ouch.
ouch. Well, I know it's aging. But yeah, the CMM adoption was going pretty well. But we had some managers who started demanding to see the inspection logs and were starting to use defect data from these software inspections, requirements inspections, as input to promotion and evaluation in the annual review. And guess what happened? All of a sudden, the defect logs emptied. Everybody came in and read defects out, and surprise, surprise, nobody had any defects. Then in the hallway, after the meeting, when the perpetrators were gone, they would hand the author the actual defect log. And yeah, and
Wow.
that just I knew that the effort was doomed at that point from a formal perspective. People were actually finding the benefit in the inspections. They would keep doing them anyway. But the formal effort was it became a stealth effort because the quality assurance data was being usurped for performance management purposes. And
Sort of
that's just the end.
obfuscation in the wrong way,
Right.
right?
Not openness and we see it in other places. Many people who are listening to this have probably experienced green light syndrome, where you raise a red light at the low level, but somewhere it goes to yellow above you, and then above that it goes to green. So by the time senior management sees it, everything's hunky dory
Sunshine,
because
the sunshine pump, almost, right?
yeah, pretty much because it's just not acceptable to share that kind of information. The culture doesn't permit that kind of openness and tact.
Yeah, we've worked with some organizations that I am familiar with where um, there is a layer of management that ends up sometimes being the sacrificial layer, um, where the beatings occur above that layer, but that manager is wise enough to know that he doesn't pass that information back down, and so that behavior is not sustainable and not happy either, right?
No, especially for the person who's in the middle. We had a term for that back in my days at Intel. I won't use the pejorative, but it was a manure shield, and the great
Nice.
managers would act as these manure shields. It was more alliterative than that. Fill in the blank, and they were priceless because I have another example there where a senior vice president got into Jira and discovered that um, John Doe, nameless software engineer, an individual, was responsible for missing the deadline. We were behind. We needed to ship. We couldn't ship. We were stuck. And a senior vice president went into the database, discovered who was at fault in his mind, and called this person and read them the riot act over the phone for being the cause of our late shipment. Well,
Wow.
it was a team, for goodness sake. It wasn't this individual's fault. They were the person trying and leading the effort to overcome this thing. But it was just despicable conduct that you would actually reach through a system like that, grab some poor person as an individual contributor by the throat, and beat them up over metrics and measurements like that.
Wow. Yeah, that's a horrible environment. I'm gonna have this nightmare in my mind of trebuchets full of manure tonight. I think when I
That's
go to
right.
sleep, it's gonna be
Yeah.
pretty funny.
So yeah, a good manager steps in front of all that. But
Yeah,
you're right; it's not really a sustainable thing for most personalities. You just get worn out by it, and you
right.
got to go.
So qualitative goals, right? Everybody can avoid the blame. Some kind of way to kind of level that across.
Yeah, that's
You know,
one more way that you can see this evident in a culture is that when failure is buried, one good way to bury it is to make qualitative goals. Because if you just want to make something better, it doesn't matter how much better. Then if you've made it better in any perceptible way, you could say we didn't fail. And it's a simple way to avoid any kind of failure accountability, not blame per se, but openly acknowledging that we didn't do as well as we could have there. Let's figure out what we can do better next time. It's just like, oh yeah, everything was better. So la la la. Next assignment.
yeah, yeah. That's not helpful in the long run. So
Yeah, and
what?
the irony to all of this, we've had since 2001 the advent of lean and agile, especially into software. And the reason it's so depressing that we don't measure anything still is that those methods are all about inspecting and adapting. And they're all about enabling continuous improvement by measurement. So this whole approach of I don't want to measure anything is anathema to these methods. It just isn't enough to use qualitative approaches and call yourself a lean or even a solid agile organization.
So these smaller increments of delivery, really afford themselves the ability to kind of see things happening, right? I mean, I think
Sure,
that's really
they're all about exposing it. Right, one of my favorite lines in teaching Kanban or Scrum or things like that is to stand up in front of all these paying people and say, using Kanban or using Scrum won't solve your software development problems. And that sinks in about 0.75 seconds, and they say, "Wait, why am I here? I came to the class to solve my problems." Well, okay,
right.
but these methods are all about visualization, and they will make the problems objectively obvious. What you do about them, though, is still up to you.
Sure. And I think that's the culture on Agile is that like you mentioned, the continuous improvement, the notion of doing retrospectives and the team declaring, that was ugly. We don't want to do that again. We want to find a different way to do it. So in a small sense, they're sampling metrics on a, data set of one, the previous sprint.
Right.
Say, hey,
Yeah.
what happened there?
Agile does afford some different ways of exposing data on a different frequency, different types. We can talk more about that a little later, I think. But
Yeah, I think
um,
sounds good.
yeah,
So perfect. So that's really that I wanted to use that as a framing context here to talk in terms of the culture things because you get to now let's really talk more in the second topic about the basics and drop into like what are these things? What do we mean when we say metrics and indicators to that? What
yeah, because
give
those
us a
terms
feel
get
for that?
bandied about pretty loosely and
Absolutely.
sometimes confusing. So I prefer a definition of measure, metric, and indicator that comes from the Handbook of Quality, Software Quality Assurance, Schulmeyer and McManus. I'm certainly not the only one, and listeners may prefer a different one, but let me just quote those for context, at least so that everything that we talk about this session is clear. A measure, by their definition, establishes the extent, dimensions, capacity, etc., of anything, especially as determined by a standard. And one easy example, there's body temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, 98.6, whatever it happens to be, is normal.
Hmm.
So that's a measure. A metric is typically a composite of two or more measures. So we could, in software, talk about something like, total severity one defects found per testing week. Now that's a metric because it combines several measures. There's the measure of total defects, there's the measure of severity one out of that, And there's the measure of time as represented by tester weeks, and we're doing some sort of simple or elegant math on those measures to create the actual metric.
And it's
And
really it's a scale you create on the fly because you invent something that's relevant to you, right? You're talking about something within a week that has meaning to an organization that you can track that over time.
right, the
So something
measures are
changed.
more absolute, and then the metrics can be composed in various ways, various compositions. They can be elegant, they can be simple, they can be effective or ineffective. It's just a question of finding the good ones out of the sheepfold there.
So
All
you're
right, and then an indicator.
yeah.
It's different than a metric. An indicator is the result of comparison of a measure or a metric with some baseline quantity or expected result. Again, quoting my age, I'm quite familiar with high blood pressure, and that's indicated
You and me, brother.
when blood pressure exceeds, say, 150 over 100. So that's a particular indicator. Now, it, it's important to say that an indicator doesn't prove some issue underlying this, because your blood pressure could be 150 over 100 because you're doing one of your stairway races or you're out on your bike in your neighborhood going up a hill. And momentarily, that's not a bad thing at all, but it can point to something as an underlying condition. So it indicates, it doesn't prove.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so you can talk about things in an absolute value sense. You can talk about things in terms of rate, right? You can look at
That's true. Yeah, density, rate, frequencies. There are some sort of canonic ways of looking at measurement here, and if you think in those terms, when you see a lot of software metrics, you can generally see that they tend to fall into various categories, like a density or a rate or something like that. And that's actually a help when we're looking for new metrics, is to think about how previously successful metrics have been constructed.
so do
Some of them
people.
are going to be more indicative than others, right? It's not to say that every indicator is identical. Some of them are more what the medical world calls diagnostic, because if it's diagnostic, then you really start to minimize a false positive, false negative. And these are all terms people are suddenly more familiar with COVID
No kidding.
and all of that, right? So these things can indicate the presence of something, but they don't necessarily prove it. And you might need a confirmatory test that's much more diagnostic. But some indicators are pretty darn diagnostic. A high white cell count is very strongly indicative of either an infection or something like a blood cancer. So it all depends on the indicator. Some are stronger than others.
Yeah, and you mentioned, and they can be things that over time you want to track, and so that becomes a rate. So you.
Sure, that's another way to break these out. An indicator can be split in two as categories. One is a Sentinel indicator, the other is rate based.
Mhm.
So an example of a Sentinel indicator, that's something that every time the indicator triggers, you would go back and take some action that you can define. That's the purpose of an indicator, is to throw a flag up for you to look at and do something. Now, what you do is up to you. But a Sentinel indicator within, say, Agile development with Scrum might be a canceled sprint. This should be a rare event. So I could put an indicator in, a Sentinel indicator for canceled sprint, that says that anytime one of the 800 Scrum teams that we had back at Intel would cancel a sprint, we could have a flag go up in the tool and say, we have a canceled sprint. Why don't we go figure out why that happens so we can learn something and prevent future ones?
So
But
that'd be a Big Bang Theory kind of thing. Like all of a sudden, you had a major recall on the market or a big defect that just stopped the presses kind of thing. Someone had to just
yeah,
basically stop the sprint, all hands on deck to fix something.
exactly. And that depends on the nature of the event. When you look at something like a plane crash, those are Sentinel indicators. There's a huge analytical thing that spins up out of that, right? Uh, but not every incident on an aircraft has that level of scrutiny. Other things are rate based. If you start seeing too many failures of a certain type over a certain time, then suddenly you trigger a review and say, what's going on? What has changed?
Would I know this is we'll step into another mucky area, but would velocity be considered a rate-based indicator for
Maybe not.
performance?
Velocity is a fine example of a metric,
Okay.
story points and time, or as measured in sprints. right?
Okay.
So we have two measures there, the story points completed, and we
In a
have
given
some measure
time.
of time. So
Gotcha.
it's a
Okay.
perfectly fine metric. Now, what's your indicator? I might look actually at acceleration or deceleration.
Okay.
If I were to see a team whose velocity decreases by some percentage, 33%, 50% on a moving average basis for 4 or 5 sprints in a row, maybe a flag goes up and say, what's going on? Why is this team slowing down? Um,
Right.
so that you could do something like that. Another one come from Scrum might be looking at the rate of story non-acceptance by the PO during demos, during sprints. We don't expect that everything that the team goes off and creates during the sprint is going to be green lighted by the PO as done. But once you're operating on a pretty good cadence, I wouldn't expect to see too much stuff thrown back by the POs. And no, you didn't get that right. And if I see that increasing over time, maybe it indicates there's some problem with the way we're doing sprint planning or backlog item decomposition or detailing. So by monitoring that kind of change, you can be alerted to some pretty good things to look at.
There's a good example. That's really helpful to clarify that. So, you and I, in different engagements, we've talked about lots of clients who do things forensically. And what I mean by that, like they'll look at what you would refer to, I guess, as trailing indicators, right? Stuff that's already occurred. You see
Yeah,
something out there, but you in your coaching and in your work with these teams want to move them to a different type of indicator, right? A leading indicator.
right. Of course. Anytime you can, and I think this isn't just me, this is everybody in the metrics space, favors leading indicators and leading metrics because uh, it goes all the way back to people like Taguchi and Total Quality. Said stop counting defects at the end of a manufacturing process and start counting the things up front that ensure there will be no defects. Loose translation from the Japanese, but if you have a choice, the leading metric is going to be far better because by the time you can calculate the trailing metric, in a sense, it's too late.
Right. You're already cleaning up.
Yeah, it's better to look at metrics around sprint planning and backlog item detailing and elaboration than it is to count failures where the PO sent it back for rework.
Give me an
And
example of a leading metric that you really like, something that people normally aren't doing, or perhaps, and it's a good suggestion to move towards that direction.
well, oh, there's some interesting ones from history. If you go way back, it's pretty interesting that NASA back in the late 80s published a paper where the kilobytes, the size of the document for the requirements for a project in kilobytes, was strongly negatively correlated with budget and schedule overrun. In other
Really?
words, the bigger the requirements document, the smaller the schedule and budget overrun. Now, today we can look at that and say, in an agile context, maybe that doesn't apply quite so easily. But the I thought it was one heck of a creative leading indicator, and it was a very strong 95% kind of correlation, which is doubly interesting because we know that large projects are more difficult, and you would assume that large projects have larger requirements documents. So there's some interesting things going on in that one. That's a historic one I've always thought was quite fascinating. But generally, we're looking at stuff in terms of what activities we're doing. And the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes the leading indicators are not obvious at all at first. How do you look at, say, PI planning within the safe environment and say, how do we know at the end of PI planning that increment is going to go well? Is there a leading indicator? And it might be something as subtle as the baseline documents that are published out of the PI planning session have at least 2 revisions in the first 5 business days because people have looked at it and said, that's not right. And if I have a PI planning doc that goes into a dark place that no one ever looks at, I could start to look and see trouble down the line because everybody's going off a set of assumptions that haven't been tested. We're unlikely to plan perfectly. So seeing some evidence of revision might give you confidence that, in fact, we have a shot at pulling this off.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some small amount of revisions. You would probably be encouraged by that a lot. You would say, "Why didn't you say anything during the meeting?"
Right. So there may
So
be a healthy range there that says this was a good PI planning session and it's been consumed by people who ought to consume it, and their reflected changes now appear in the plan itself.
yeah,
So sometimes these are very indirect, and the key is we're not necessarily looking for a causal relationship. A strong correlation is good enough.
that makes complete sense, and I think these examples I think are perfect. What so this is kind of driving us all towards the last topic we're going to talk about, really, which is about the process that you might use when working with a new organization trying to get started, trying to help them control things like the effort and cost associated with putting these things together.
Right.
Because there's certainly, it's actually not, it's not the process of doing the work, right? People are doing the work and doing their jobs. This is measuring and instrumenting some of that stuff. And so,
Right.
from the standpoint of the perceived business value, it's something that the team needs to do, the organization needs to get familiar with, but it doesn't deliver business value necessarily by itself. So there's always going to be a management overhang that doesn't want to spend a tremendous amount of time and effort on this stuff, but they are interested in wanting to find a way to get better so that the whole machine runs better, right? So,
Yeah, you could argue this is necessary waste, right?
yeah,
Because we would
absolutely.
ideally not wish to have to measure it all. We would just get it right the first time and never have to look. But yeah,
So when you start working with a team, like, how, what do you do? Do you talk them through things like where to make decisions, for example?
for sure. Because this obviously there's so much that is potentially measurable. Anybody who's adopted Kanban enables just enormous quantities of data to be captured and analyzed. All sorts of metrics come out of that. And so does Scrum, so does almost any good software process. It's going to start exposing lots of opportunities, lots of data points. If you just start measuring, then what's the point of that? You're just going to create a bunch of data. So the key is to start first by looking at what it is you want to focus on. And the three we hear most often right now are quality. A lot of people are having trouble with quality, especially as they turn up the velocity too far. And to focus on performance, how do I get more done with less? And then senior management still cares a lot about predictability, and sometimes agile implementations tend to be at some odds with predictability. So those are three classics, but where an organization chooses to focus is as diverse a topic as the organizations themselves. It's important though to figure out what are your top priorities because you got to focus at the beginning of this, especially.
So you have people that come together, and you have to bat that around a bit.
Yeah, yeah, because different stakeholders may have different priorities, and the scope of the measurement effort helps to define that and rein it in to figure out exactly what are our top priorities because we can't do everything at once.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, and I think these same sort of things frame our assessment activities, and you and I talked about that in a prior podcast, right? Where you
Yeah,
you you put the business focus on something and say, hey, we are really concerned about, we're starting to ship a lot of trash out there, and it's coming back to us, and it's eating us alive, and we're
yeah,
doing a lot of rework and things like that. So, if a business would surface that kind of idea, that would be the first one you would start thinking about with the team and with the organization, to say, all right, we probably want to focus on that a little bit and try and
right.
get that stabilized.
Yeah, and there's been some bake in of this idea in the metrics literature over the years. The early '90s, Vic Basili and others developed a concept called GQM, goal question metric. So this has been an effective way to derive metrics for quite some time. And it starts with a goal, a focus. Is what is it we're trying to achieve? And then it allows one or three questions for what questions do we need to answer in order to make that assessment. And only after those questions are answered or asked and framed do we have the scope for metric definition. And that helps constrain our efforts a lot. I used to joke with folks that the only alternative to goal question metric is metric, metric, metric. And we just start measuring stuff because we can, not because it supports a particular goal or an activity we have an interest in.
Right.
And that's the death of a lot of metrics programs. They just take on too much water and sink.
So, tell me different ways to define and structure measurements when you're working with a new organization. What do you try and surface with them to get them to think about it?
So once we've got those focus areas. Yeah. We have to look at what's available and what we can create if it isn't already available. And that depends on the nature of the development process. And it also depends on the nature of the work. Listeners may be familiar with Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework. It's also described in Steve's More Effective Agile in the software context. And if you look around those quadrants, if you're looking at something in the obvious quadrant, which is now, by the way, called clear in 2020, the clear quadrant is so straightforward that it's going to afford certain abilities to measure that aren't necessarily achievable in anywhere else. And this is the sort of thing you might get statistics out of doing an oil change shop, that you just get a stream of cars coming through and you change the oil. There's not a lot of art required for that. It's pretty straightforward to measure
Right.
the performance
Right.
of this. You move up to complicated, and suddenly goal question metric plays a much stronger role in that space, because the complication involved means that it isn't just obvious what to go and measure and how to do it. So step across to the complex domain. And although some people, including Steve McConnell, have occasionally wondered whether GQM is effective there, I think that for the right definition of goal, it can be applied. We don't want deterministic goals in a complex environment. We can't have a nirvana-based optimum, but we can still set directional aspirational goals over there and achieve some measures and metrics and indicators that are effective in that space. Especially important there to focus on the sort of leading indicators that you can get, because as Dave says, obsession with the present and fine-grained objects and things are the way to go. And then down in the chaotic domain, why are we measuring anything? Because there is no perceivable cause-effect kind of relationship, so never mind. So depending on the nature of the work, that is going to some degree, enable or constrain the type of metrics and indicators we can create.
Makes sense.
It's also true that different systems themselves, different settings, are going to enable different forms of metrics. So if you are a Scrum team or three creating software, then you can probably build your entire system in these nice releasable vertical slices. In broader systems, that can be impossible. My history at Intel.
Complexity, right?
Yeah, you've got a laptop and it's got all kinds of different software in it, and it's got networking involved and all the rest of this. And we can't, sadly, we can't build a CPU in slices necessarily. We can do some simulation, we can do some emulation, we can do some things like that. But the nature of that system itself means that we can't necessarily measure directly what we would like to. So in one sense, there's a nice book by Bruce Douglas, 2 S's, called Agile Systems Engineering. And he points out that in some senses, all you can get to in some of these systems is an Agile specification, because construction really has to proceed in a bit more of the traditional systems engineering form. And you can't just iterate willy-nilly. So in that kind of a dependency constrained environment, we have to look and say what's available to us to help measure things.
But in a big picture sense, though, you're still doing agile practices because you commit as an organization to get further into the exploration.
Yes, and I still think there's plenty of fine-grained agility possible within that. Not necessarily agile, but fine-grained agility, even during the construction phase, as we learn more about the system and we change plans as we can in order to take advantage of what we learn, what doesn't work as well as we think, what works better than we think. But all of that requires some form of measurement.
Right. I mean, another one of your big things I know that I've heard you talk quite a bit about is making sure that when clients start exploring here is that you have good scales of measurement that you set up, right?
Yes,
you don't
for
want to
sure.
be arbitrary with that. You want to be really clear about what you're doing, but be very well focused about what you're going to measure.
Yeah, there's a couple dimensions to that. The first would be to decide on the scale itself as to how are we going to quantify whatever it is that we're trying to get to. Lots of ways to get at that. One that people could explore, and it's in our training at least, is a trio from Ralph Keeney. He wrote a book back in the 90s called Value Focused Thinking, and Keeney used to run NASA. He's a pretty smart guy. And in the book, he talks about how to measure and make improvements in things like uh, really complicated things like early view of climate change and nuclear waste transport, some of these things, or even abortion and family planning, some things that were just intractable. He goes after in this book and makes some progress on it, at least for reasonable people. He defines in there three types of scale: natural, constructed, and proxy. So a natural scale would be like body temperature in degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit, depending on what your preference is. Those are scales that pretty much everybody understands. They make sense for the underlying quantity, no problem. Where you've got natural scales, use them because they're so intelligible and well understood. But if you were trying to measure something like environmental impact, we haven't got a single measure like degrees Celsius for environmental impact. So one of the things you could do if you wanted to construct a new factory or something is that you could create what Keeney would call a constructed scale for environmental impact. Poll your stakeholders, get their inputs, and then we can define a scale from 1 to 7 in integers. And 1 means less than X acres of wetlands destroyed, less than Y degrees change in the stream water temperature outside the plant, less than Z tons of pollutants out the stacks every year, while 7 means many times that and bad. So 1 is good, 7 is bad. And as long as we polled the stakeholders correctly and we've shared this definition with everyone, we can come to a clear, common, and coherent understanding of what environmental impact might be within that context. Not that it's for everyone forever, but at least it works well enough for that.
So
And
would
then
these things be like in a software environment? Would you be talking about, I don't know, how the domain that you're in has particular difficult choices to make or measure or understand, and so getting people who are business focused to talk about that um, might be able to come up with terms that they would feel are have higher business value than maybe a technocrat would be
right,
able to do.
right, because you can either decompose these things. So take software right now, privacy, security, those are big deals.
Right.
We don't have a degrees Celsius for security. It's so multifaceted and nuanced that you're never going to find that.
If you pay
So
Bitcoin to somebody, you probably have a metric.
yeah, yes, it fails. I think that's a Sentinel indicator personally, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So we could, well, there's only two alternatives. We can either try to take this nebulous, complex thing called security and cut it into smaller parts that are easier to handle, and that's a valid strategy. Or we can try to create a multidimensional scale that tries to do some of the same in place and say we can measure security on a 1 to 10 scale based on this multi-attribute kind of rating system. So you really only have those two choices: divide and conquer, or create a scale to play it as it lies, if you'll borrow a golf metaphor, and just go from there.
I like golf metaphors; they work for me.
Yeah. So then
So,
this third
yeah,
scale type is proxy, right? So you've got a natural scale, use it when you've got one. Constructed is one alternative if you can't. The other one is a proxy scale, a stand-in. And those happen a lot because we end up not being able to measure the thing we really want to directly. If you
canary
develop
in the coal
software,
mine kind of idea, maybe.
well, that's more a leading indicator.
Okay,
In
true.
this case, well, that is a proxy too, because we don't put a person in the cage and wait for them to die.
Yeah.
But the canary is more sensitive, so it's a bit of a leading indicator more than a proxy. Proxy, a good example of that is reliability. If you've written much software to go into, say, an IT environment, you've probably had an experience like this. You know that it's going to go into a network environment. So you put network sniffers out there, packet sniffers, and you record a bunch of the actual network traffic from the client's network. And you bring it back to your lab where you're writing software, your test lab, and you recreate their network topology using the same brand, same version, same everything of equipment. And you start replaying back their network traffic across this topology, and you test your system and it works great. So then you roll it out into the real system and it crashes in 30 seconds.
Hmm.
So we can't really measure what we want to measure, which is in field performance. We try the best we can to measure proxies, but they're imperfect. They're stand-ins. Another good
Right.
example is crash test dummies. In my requirements class, I used to give a requirement to say the use of the device shall reduce fatalities by 25% in the event of a catastrophic failure. And I would ask the people in the room, is that a testable requirement? And the testers in the room would think for 5 seconds and then get an evil grin on their face and say, yeah,
I'll bet they
I could
would.
test that. First, we need a baseline. So I need some volunteers to go through a catastrophic failure without the device. It will set the
Nice.
baseline fatality rate. And then after you've all watched that, we'll ask for some more volunteers. You put the device on, go through it again, and we'll see if 25% fewer of you or better are killed. So we tend not to do that. So we developed these crash test dummies instead, instrumented mannequins that can give us a very high correlation again with the actual outcome we want.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense.
So Keeney gives us some help there, because if you're stuck on how to measure something, first look for natural. If you can't do that, either construct a scale or look for a stand-in, a proxy that might be measurable at a time or a cost that's preferable to the measurement that you might have made directly.
So here's the pushback question. I think you would probably get. I mean, people listen to us so far talking about this, and they're and to a manager, they might think in their head, "Wow, the costs are just piling up on putting something like this in place. It's going to be a
Right.
lot of time. I'm going to suck a lot of bandwidth away from people who should be doing, product development or should be doing some kind of business value generation." So, what are some of the ways that you would counter that to an executive who might be peering into the box and saying, "No, I don't want to do that." What
Yeah.
things?
So we already talked about one. The first item, maybe the first two items on the list are focus, right? Go in with a
Right.
very clear boundary around what you want to go and measure and what stuff, even if it was convenient and cheap, you're just not going to look at right now. So keep your scope in a limited fashion, and that limits the cost as well. But there are other things to do. The first is look at what's already around as you're identifying metrics. If you've got a choice of using a proxy that you're already measuring versus having to go off and create a new process, an instrument, a new tool to do it, then don't incur that cost without a darn good reason. Go after that. One of the Intel managers I worked for used to talk about measuring data exhaust, because the system itself produces data. And if we can use that data that's already being produced as sort of a measurement of the exhaust, the output, the waste product of the system, to measure its performance, just like a pollution control center will measure the exhaust if you go in to re-register your car and say your car is healthy or no, it's not. Then our operational focus today, there, right? There's a pretty good utility in going to measure data exhaust, saying, is my process healthy? Uh, and then finally, back to the GQM, right? Remember, metric is the only alternative to that. If you don't know why you're measuring something, even within a focus area, then why are you measuring it? It's just inertial. Do you know that someone is actually still using this information? Does everybody really understand it the same way?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, right? I mean, you have, metrics for the sake of metrics are useless. You want to
Right.
be doing something that drives you forward, right? I mean,
And frankly, if you're still measuring the same things now that you were measuring 4 or 5 years ago, I'm curious as to why. Because continuous improvement should have led you to a place where there's a whole lot more interesting stuff that you should be and could be measuring than what you were measuring 5 years ago.
so things like, I'm thinking that you have people in an organization that might be really those detail hawks that are just, tuning, playing all the time, right? And at some point in time, getting data that you can actually use against everyday practices is probably more useful than sitting there and tweaking forever,
Yeah,
trying to come up with the perfect data set, right? I mean,
that's true. If you're going to spend effort, I would say spend effort in the definition of this. One thing we haven't really pushed on here is how important it is to define the terms that go into these metrics. Because if you don't, then people are going to be misinterpreting the data across the whole spectrum, from generating the data to analyzing it to interpreting it to make decisions. I've seen horrible problems in metrics when people uh, didn't have a common definition for something even as basic as severity in a defect. Because if we're starting to look at a metric like I quoted earlier for severity one defects located per tester week, first, what's a defect? Second, what's a severity one defect? And if you look across a large organization, you might find a scary number of different definitions for those things. And any of the calculations you make are sort of contingent on people understanding that in a reasonably similar fashion.
So another way to address the cost issue or the time issue is that, certainly when you're starting off a new program, a lot of the data collection would end up being manual. You're pawing through some stuff that you saw in the past and trying to come up with something new. But eventually, you can apply automation to that, right? So that would be a cost driver. You might, in inception costs might be a little higher, but over time, you say, okay, I can write a bunch of application around this, wrapper around this, and instrument it. And now I have something automatically being fed to me on a regular basis.
Yes, and that works fine. I've done that at various points in my career, even back as far as instrumenting user applications within .ini files in Windows 3 to capture local performance data to feed the development team with information it could never have gotten in any other way. And at first, you would try to go off and sit with users and capture this data. That's too expensive. It's too time consuming. So once you figure out that, yeah, we can get the data and it is helpful, then you go off to automate it. And it's worth the automation cost. That one time cost to automate is the long term payoff as long as the data is going to be in use for a while.
Right. I mean, you got to be convincing people that every measurement that you do is going to cost something, whether it's somebody's time doing it, somebody writing the automation around it,
Yes. Yeah, that's something that,
analyzing it, and making and doing actions based upon the data. You certainly want to commit to that as an organization. So
absolutely.
there's a cost to that, right?
There is, and I think everyone has to be aware of that. It's so easy to blithely wave your hands and say, "Can't we just collect some data about that?" Yes, you can. It's going to cost something, and that's been driven home to me across my career, even as far back as my first job out of grad school, doing a trauma registry for trauma patients in the state of Oregon. We had to have clinical folks, nurses, and data records people, manually abstracting our data from written patient records. So we were acutely aware of the cost to small hospitals around the state and rural areas to have to go in and dig out data for us. And we were very careful to ask only for the things that were absolutely necessary. And I realized there's plenty of benefit in that. I've carried that kind of philosophy all along the way. Uh, I see too much accretive metric program where you start collecting something and you never stop even
And
if
it
it's
just
5
grows
years
out of
longer. Yeah.
control, right?
And the
Yeah,
program gets more and more expensive, and we're just doing this because we've always done it this way.
yeah.
And that's silly. We need to keep looking at our focus areas. We need to keep looking at our goals. We need to keep adapting our set of metrics and indicators so that they serve us well and cost as little as possible.
Keeping them active is a good idea.
Oh yeah, evergreen for sure.
Absolutely. So let's pull all this together, right? We talked a little bit about the cultural aspects, talked about what do we mean by when we're talking about metrics and indicators. We talked a little bit about, sort of some ideas you have when you breach the subject with an organization. And so let's kind of say, here's a new organization that comes to us, right? And you've done a lot of these engagements to kind of give the guidance on how to do this stuff. So what do you normally try and do as a sort of time flow description when you start working with the organization? What do you ask for first? What kind of things?
Yeah, well, it kind of follows the flow we've already had here. The first thing to do is get the right stakeholders into a common area, a common moment when we can describe what the focus will be and derive the goals.
Which can be a bigger challenge than you'd think, right?
It
Sometimes.
it really can, and there's a lot of kind of grounding that happens and normalization across different stakeholder groups because you might have somebody from human resources telling you, no, you can't measure that, and here's why. And engineering says, but we need to measure this, and here's why. Finance, other people are getting in there saying, I want you to calculate that this way and amortize this. So yeah, it gets really interesting in that real setting. But it's important work, and as I say, it is perhaps slightly more effort prone and expensive to do that right up front, but the long term payoff is absolutely worth that investment. If you shortchange that effort, you're going to end up with metrics that cost you day after day after day.
Right. So you get this team together and you maybe they out what they have been doing. You talk about some initial metrics and indicators based upon the goals they have, and again, we're back to
Yeah,
the business goals, right?
right. And that initial metric set, that's the first kind of milestone of the work, is when we've got the proposed scope of metrics up on the board. We sort of postpone working on all the scales and things. We just describe the metrics we want to capture. And once that scope looks right, then we dive in and look at both the definitions required. And there are almost always a lot of definitions required for clarification with this to get that good quality data that makes the metric valid and lets people not quite use the damn lies and statistics metaphor quite so often.
Right.
Like good definitions can reduce a lot of that misinterpretation and sort of squidge room that people.
Well, some of it's recursive too. You might have a definition that they've been using for a long time that you see fault in, or you see some issues with how they've been describing it. So you want to
Of
make
course,
improvements to those definitions, right?
right. And some companies are better at keeping that kind of vocabulary up to date and or not, and or addressing it or not.
Right.
And you do an acquisition, you do a merger, and suddenly there's a bunch of new people who think
Stuff
differently.
gets
And now,
muddy.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Or you're blending different models or different
yeah.
ideas that people had
So there's
that
a moderate lift there because you got to go through and look at candidate metrics and do some math on measures and say, okay, these are the things that look like the best set for us for this set of metrics. And then we got to go off and test these metrics and indicators for some period of time. Ideally several data cycles, whatever they are. Because if you've got stuff that's measured by release, we got to measure it for a few releases and say, does this really work, and tell us what we
sure.
want, and we validate that the message is real, and then basically adjust both based on feedback originally and then what we've learned along the way, and evolve them as they change, because they will. It's got to be evergreen because they get stale pretty fast otherwise. And as I say, if you're still measuring the same stuff now you were 5 years ago, why is that?
Yeah. It's a big question to answer. And you better have an answer if they're still doing it that way, right? So
Yeah.
give me some examples, to close this out. Let's talk about some examples that you have done in the last year or so with some of the clients we've worked with, and just give a little bit of context for the kind of things they surfaced, and maybe as a way for people to think about, hey, we have the same issues.
Yeah, well, we could maybe pick one out of quality that focus, because that's been
Sure,
one
let's do
that's
that.
really common. Uh, let's look at something like find fix interval. That's a venerable old metric that looks at the interval between defect location and defect removal. Okay, how long did it take? So I could go and write up a pretty simple metric based on those two measures, the date of location and the date of removal, verified removal by test, right? I can define those. See, we're already defining the term. What does it mean removed? It doesn't mean the developer saying I fixed it. It means that somebody up the line in test has said, I verified that it's now working correctly. Or is it ready for release? Or is it, because if the customer is involved, suddenly the customer doesn't care that it's ready for release if they're waiting 6 months to get it in release. The fix interval for them seems to include that time. So immediately you see the power of the definition, the necessity of going in and looking at some of that to say, what do you mean fix? What's the verified correction or release or whatever it is? But then you get back and look at a word like defect. And are they all the same? Well, most of our clients have cared to look at severity, because obviously a high severity defect or showstopper, whatever you call that top tier, is going to be a little more urgent than something that is low severity, and we'll fix it at some point. So the defect, the find fix interval, uh, it can be a simple mean of all defects based on those definitions, but that's a little ham fisted. You could do a lot better than that by looking at this across severity. And the most elegant ways, the most effective ways I've seen this done is to calculate a score based on severity and closure interval and start tracking this sort of score, because that allows you to weight the severities in any way you want. So you can make critical doubly important as high, doubly important as medium, doubly important as low, or you can make them any kind of other weighting that you want and see how the system is performing to remove these defects. And it isn't necessarily a direct measurement of the days. It's the days put into categories, stratified by severity, and you can get a really nuanced picture of how the system's performing with that. So you've got a lot of choices, even in a simple metric like find fix interval.
Yeah, that's a great example. I appreciate that. I think we're kind of bumping up against the end of the time slot here. I'd love to talk more about that, but I think we're going to have to call this a wrap. So,
Yeah, it's
you
a
know,
big area, as you
yeah,
say at the top.
I think
And
I really appreciate you coming back on the podcast and shedding some light and clarity to this topic. And I know it's huge. Maybe we can, maybe there's enough. I don't think there's enough things that we can come back and talk
yeah.
about it on another session. Maybe topics
Well,
like,
listeners,
you know,
give
you know,
us some input. What out of this field is really vexing to you that you want to get some advice on?
yeah,
All I would say is don't let this field intimidate you. Don't be discouraged. Get in there, set your focus, get a bounded focus, and then spend the time up front to get some good quality metrics with some good solid definitions under them and some verifiable data. And you'll realize that life's a lot better that way. Not
awesome.
discounting the cultural challenges that are always lurking, right?
Sure.
That too.
Awesome. As Picard would say, make it so.
Yeah.
Excellent, sir. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
So be sure to tune in again for another episode of Inspect and Adapt, the Construx podcast. Until then, this has been Mark Griffin as your host. Liz Ostaszewski has been our audio engineer, and Devin Musgrave is our producer. Everybody, keep staying safe out there and have a great next sprint.
If you enjoyed this episode and you have comments or would like to talk with one of our practitioners, reach out via email using comments@construx.com. Again, that's comments@construx.com. We'd love to hear from you.